My name is Jacqueline Kurlowski, and I am the director of the Edgar Dyer Institute for Leadership and Public Policy at Coastal Carolina University. And in addition to my role at the Institute, I also teach in the Department of Politics. I teach courses on public policy and also on grant writing. And today, I'd like to just share a little bit about voting with you. I know we have some upcoming big elections, and I wanted to take this chance to impress upon you how important your role is in voting and part of our democracy. So first, I'll share with you just a small story. When I was a little girl, my parents took me to the polling center on election day, and I remember being very young and going into the ballot booth with a little pin pusher, and I would push the ballot. My parents would point, and I would then cast the vote for them. It was always fun. We looked forward to it, and that's something that my parents did. I don't think they were trying to instill in me the importance of voting or trying to form the habit of being a good citizen and exercising the right to vote. But what it did for me is it shared with me the process of voting and also gave me the chance to feel like I was participating in the process even at a young age. And I always enjoyed at the end where you get to put the ballot into the actual box. You get an election sticker, an I voted sticker, much like this one that I would wear proudly all day at school, and many of my other classmates had the same sort of experiences. And if you didn't have that same experience, that's okay. Really, what matters most is that you're here now and that you can exercise your right to vote and that you can begin now forming the important habit of voting. And that's the most important thing. So forming good habits not only for just our, being good citizens, but also voting, it does take practice. And we're here today because we have upcoming elections. And before we talk about the importance and the gravitas of the presidential election, just think back to, the previous election. Did you vote perhaps in a local election maybe last year or 2 years ago? Did you vote in any of those elections that were in your community, either locals, county, or state? Often the turnout for smaller elections and non-presidential years has lower turnout because I know the presidential election has more gravitas, more national interest, it's more glitzy. I get that, but keep in mind that often it's the local elections that will impact you more as far as your life and how your public policy and citizenry meets the government. So your role as a citizen with the government, that often happens at a very localized level. So don't forget that local turnout is important for local issues, which actually have a larger impact on your life than let's say the next presidential election. Those are big policy changes, big things for the nation. But if someone's going to tell you when and where you can walk your dog on the streets or dog parks or school districts or local judges. I mean, those are all things that can have big impacts on your life at a local scale. So as we get started here on this brief talk, I want to talk a little bit to you about the history of voting because it's important. The Constitution, as it was originally written, actually did not establish specifically who could vote or who could not vote. But it did certainly give us the right to vote in the sense that we are going to be a democracy and, out of many, one. So that the role of voting was given to us by the founding fathers. And I like to think they all had some founding women at their sides who also, understood the importance of making sure that we had free and fair elections. Now, I think probably the biggest step forward for elections, because at first it was just white males, landowners primarily, who were voting, actually occurred just after the Civil War, and it was in 1869 with the 15th Amendment, and this gave African American males the right to exercise their vote. Now, unfortunately, there were a lot of artificial hurdles that were put in place for that population, unjustly so. things such as the poll tax, literacy tests, just to name a couple, but basically lots of measures in place to discourage African American males from actually being able to vote. This was not fully remedied really until 1964 with the 24th Amendment, which ended the poll tax and brought about the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was monumental, and it actually did away with a lot of the Jim Crow era laws, which disenfranchised many voters. So that was monumental. Also monumental, it wasn't until 1920 that women got the right to vote, and that happened with the 19th Amendment. So many of your great-great-grandmothers likely were some of the first women in your generational line who actually had the chance to vote. And then finally, something that still kind of lingers around today, it was back in 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18. So prior to that, you had to be 21. So that's just sort of a brief history. Like, we've still had some major steps forward with voting just in the recent decades, which have impacts for us today. So keep that in mind that, voting, a lot of people fought for the right to vote. A lot of people were, disenfranchised from voting. So it's not something to take lightly. It really is a, granted to you in the Constitution, and you should embrace the opportunity. So a couple of things I'll talk to you about, which I think some people might easily point to as reasons why they don't vote, or things that prevent them from voting. And the first thing is Monday morning quarterbacking, right? So that's the idea that the morning after the election, let's say it was really close and it came down to the wire, and only the difference was just in a handful of votes. This has happened in more elections, I think, than you'd realize. And people will say, oh, if I had known it was going to be that close, I would have voted. And my reaction to that is, it could always be that close, because elections have real consequences. And, despite what you may think, your vote does count. And even if there's no sort of inkling to think it's going to be a close election, it's always best to still say, go, turn out, cast your ballot, because then there won't be any regret in the Monday morning quarterbacking when hindsight is 20/20. And I think the most, prime example of this occurred back in the year 2000. That was with George W. Bush versus Al Gore in the presidential election, and it was such a close race. Obviously, Bush narrowly won that election, and it all came down to the state of Florida, where essentially the popular vote, it was so close, triggered an automatic recount of those ballots, and it was actually played out in a Supreme Court case on Bush v. Gore, and I think that the final number was 537 votes. That was the presidency. It all came down to Florida. And again, I'm sure people were saying, had I known it would have been that close, I would have turned out. And whether you're for Bush or for Gore, I think it being that close was uncomfortable for everyone. So again, it really does come down to turnout. In my courses, I sometimes hear students say that they don't vote because their voice or their vote doesn't count. And it really, that's disheartening for me to hear, because your vote does count. It is important. Even if you're going to be voting and you know that you have a dissenting view, or your viewpoint is in a minority for your state or county, that's no reason to stay home. Because I think it's important for the dissenting voice to be strong, to be united. So let's say you're living in a southern state that is typically Republican, and the governor is running for re-election. So that would be a situation where you have an incumbent, so someone who's already in office looking to gain that seat again, and you're saying, well, there's no point, they're going to win. My Democratic candidate, with a liberal platform, will never win, okay? And, I understand people have that realistic viewpoint of it's unlikely for their candidate to necessarily win. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't turn out, because I want that new governor who, despite, is not your candidate of choice, you don't want them winning by a landslide and thinking that everyone in the state loves them. You want to be part of that strong dissenting voice to say, you know what, 60% of the people voted for you, but guess what? 40% did not. So you have to pay attention to that 40% because you are still our governor too. And that's just an example of, being part of that dissenting voice is important. You don't want to necessarily stay home on election day just because you feel that your candidate won't win. It might be a long shot in some elections, and that's fine. Long shots, are out there, but it's still really important for you to have your voice be heard. So I have a few takeaways, and the most important takeaway is around the theme of turnout matters, okay? Turnout in elections are the people who actually go and vote, okay, at the polls or send in absentee ballots if they can't make it to the polls. Turnout is often unequal, right? So if you have turnout to the polls, which is unequal, often the results of those elections are skewed because there's a larger percentage of people who simply did not turn out. And I'll give you an example. Unfortunately, the younger generation, so people in their 20s, turn out less often than, say, people who are in their 60s, people who are retired. So it should be no surprise that our elected officials understand that their strong base of voters is indeed people over 60. It should be no surprise that the elected officials are aware of who their electorate is. Well, the electorate are people who actually vote. So if you get out and vote, and if bring your friends with you and bring your roommates, and to increase those numbers of young people participating in elections, that will then have positive impacts for young people's concerns, your voices, your platforms, your viewpoints being heard and addressed by your elected officials. And at the end of the day, voting comes down to having your voice be part of the conversation. So you at no level want to ever abdicate or give up that right to vote, because by doing so, you're sort of silencing yourself from your democratic engagement. And I think that voting is free. It's relatively painless. There might be a small line on some big election days, like the presidential election, but I don't think people will regret exercising their right to vote. They might regret not turning out if all of a sudden elections are not going the way it was expected. And again, like I mentioned, we've seen this happen time and time again, where elections take a turn and people say, gosh, had I known, or oh, had more young people or more minorities or more women turned out, it could have changed the election. So living in the information era, you have all the resources you need at your fingertips to find out about the actual ballot that you will see on election day in your municipality. You can look up the PDF images of that ballot. You can look up specific people, specific things that might be raised in your community. Take some time to look that over. And I recommend that because then when you go into the ballot box, you know exactly which ones you want to punch. And yet, a word of caution, we are in the information age, but that means you have to be so careful about where you consume your information. Unfortunately, there are a lot of nefarious actors out there and disinformation, and so you just have to really be on guard for the information that not only you consume on a daily basis, but information that then you use to base decisions. Not just decisions for voting, but decisions for your health, decisions for your family. I often say to my policy classes, like, I sometimes feel like people do more research on what restaurant to eat at based upon, or more, looking at Amazon reviews and figuring out the best, product, more research into that than they do with whom who they should be electing on election day. So take that information, make sure it's from a good source, and choose wisely. And as I mentioned, your vote does have consequences, and do not give up that right to someone else. Do not give up that right and say, I'm young, no one cares, because that's just not the case. It's your one voice, but one voice of many. So as I mentioned, get out and vote, and most importantly, take someone with you, because voting is habit forming, and I promise that you will not regret voting, but you may do so. You may regret not voting if you notice that elections are too close to call, and you say, oh, I wish I coulda, woulda. So there's no harm in always making sure your voice is heard, because that's the point of democracy. So thanks for your attention. Best of luck, and most importantly, get out and vote. Thanks so much. Take care.